Hey bag ladies and bag dudes, I'm Sarah Lawson from Sew Sweetness, and today I'm going to show you how to make the Kennedy bag. The Kennedy bag is a messenger bag with extra special detailing on the flap with buckles, and there's also some buckles on the side, although if you prefer more of a simple messenger bag, you can feel free to leave those off. So grab your supplies and let's get started. Okay, before we begin, you'll need to print out the pattern file, and you always want to open the PDF pattern using Adobe Reader. It's a free program that you can download to your computer or device if you don't already have it. And you want to always print at actual size, so you don't want to print at scaling or fit to page. It needs to be actual size. So the last 3 pages of the PDF file are the pattern pieces, and on page number 2 of the pattern pieces, you'll notice a 1-inch square and a 4-centimeter square. So you want to measure either one of those squares to make sure that they measure exactly either 1 inch or 4 centimeters. So I'm going to take my quilting ruler and measure that 1-inch square just to verify that it is indeed 1 inch. So it shouldn't be slightly smaller or slightly larger, it needs to be exact. Okay, so let me show you how to tape these 3 pages together. So I'm going to start by taping together page 1 and page 2. So I'm going to cut out the left-hand margin on page 2. Okay, and I'm going to tape these 2 pages together, making sure to line up the triangle that's on the side edge of each page. And you also want to just visually verify that the artwork forms a continuous line. So I'm just going to take some tape and tape those pages together. And I'm going to follow that same process to tape page 3 to page 2. So I'm going to cut out the left-hand margin on page 3. And then again, line up those triangles and tape the pages together. Okay, so you're going to cut out all of your pattern pieces to the outside of the thick black line. If you're using cork or leather for your accents, so there's 3 pages that have dashed lines on them, 3 pattern pieces with dashed lines, and you'll just want to reference those and cut them out on the dashed lines if you are using cork or leather. So after you've cut out all of your pattern pieces, they should look like this. And you'll use these pattern pieces as well as the measurements in the cutting instructions to cut out all of your fabric and interfacing pieces. Okay, so let me show you how to attach the fabric to interfacing. We'll start off with the lining flap. So I'm going to go ahead and flip my lining fabric so that it's right side facing down. And then the side of the shape flex interfacing that feels bumpy to your fingertips is the side that will go against the wrong side of the fabric. And I usually recommend a pressing cloth for ironing on your interfacing. I generally skip the pressing cloth for my videos just so you can see exactly what I'm doing. But my iron is set at the cotton setting, and I'm just going to glide it over each area of the fabric for a few seconds. And you can use steam if you wish. And you just want to keep the iron moving until all areas of the interfacing are properly secured to the fabric. When you've finished ironing the interfacing to the fabric, you just want to do a quick check to make sure that the interfacing is properly adhered. So to do that, I generally like to try to peel back a corner of the fabric from the interfacing, and if it peels back easily, that just means you need to iron it a bit longer. And if you try to peel it back with your fingernail and it's strongly secured, then you're good to go. So you'll repeat the same process with all of the pieces that need to be attached to the shape flex interfacing. And there's one more type of interfacing that I'll show you how to attach, and that's the foam interfacing. So I've got my exterior flap. If your foam interfacing is fusible, you'll go ahead and fuse it to the wrong side of your fabric in the same manner as what you just did with the shape flex. My foam is a sew-in foam. I like using by Annie's Soft and Stable, so I'm just going to go ahead and lay the fabric on top of the foam and press to make sure it's flat. And I'm going to use Wonder Clips to hold the outer edges of the fabric to the foam interfacing. So I'm going to use a basting stitch on my sewing machine to attach the fabric to the foam. And I usually like to lengthen my stitch length to 4 millimeters because it makes the process go by a bit faster. I'm going to sew the entire outer edge using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and you'll repeat the same process with all of the fabric pieces that need to be attached to the foam interfacing, and when you've finished, make sure you change back to your normal stitch length, and my regular stitch length is 2.5 millimeters. Okay, so now we're going to attach the flap accent to the exterior flap. So I'll show you both methods. If you're using cork or leather, you should have one piece cut out on the dashed line of your pattern piece. That's what I'm using for this demonstration, but I also wanted to show you what to do if you're sewing with quilting cotton or a fabric that will fray. So if that's the case, you should have 2 pieces cut out of your flap accent pattern piece, not on the dashed line, just on the regular solid line. And I'm going to go ahead and place these 2 pieces so that they're right sides together. Okay, so I'm going to pin the inner edge, so this is the concave edge. And we're going to be sewing this inner edge that's pinned using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So let's take this over to the sewing machine and get this sewn in place. Okay, so now I'm going to make little clips wherever there's a curved edge, and the clips are going to be about 1/8 of an inch high. And you want to make a clip approximately every 1/2 inch. And what that does is helps the curved edge turn smoothly when we go to press it wrong sides together. Okay, so now I'm going to press this wrong sides together. I'm going to use my fingers to roll out the seam and then just take my iron and give all of the finished areas a good press. Okay, so now your accent is ready to attach to your exterior flap. So this next series of steps will be the same no matter if you're working with an accent made of quilting cotton or what I'm using, a piece of cork or leather. So go ahead and pull out your exterior flap and lay your flap accent directly on top, so the sides and the bottom should be aligned. I'm going to place some wonder clips to hold the edges together. And we're going to be sewing the entire outer edge of this flap accent using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to slightly increase my stitch length for this top stitching. So I'm going to increase to about 2.5 to 3 millimeters for my stitch length here. So again, we're stitching around the entire outer edge of this flap accent. Okay, now go ahead and pull out your lining flap, and we're going to be installing the male half of the magnetic snap. So the male half of the snap is the portion with the little nub, and my magnetic snaps came with washer, so I'm going to use the washer for mine. If yours did not come with a washer, I'll show you how to install it without having the washer present. So I'm going to use my flap pattern piece to mark the center of my flap, and I'm going to measure 1.5 inches up from the bottom edge, and I'm going to make a mark. Okay, so if your magnetic snap did not come with a washer, you're just going to go ahead and center your snap over the marking that you made and mark where both of the prongs are on your fabric. If you do have the washer, go ahead and center that circle cutout in the middle of the washer directly on top of the marking that you made, and then mark for both of the prongs. We're also going to make the same markings on a scrap of interfacing, so you can use a scrap of foam or a piece of Peltex or Decovil Heavy, just something to reinforce this area that will have that metal snap installed. So I'm also going to center that washer on the scrap of interfacing and mark prong placement there. Okay, so I'm going to use my seam ripper to cut slits where the markings are, and you always want to start with a smaller slit. You can always make a smaller slit bigger. And then I'm also going to make the slits through the fabric. Especially when I'm using cotton fabric for portions that I'll be cutting slits through, I usually like to follow the slits with a bit of seam sealant. So I'm using fray block, and I'm just going to put a dab on each of the slits that I made. And then I'm going to insert the snap through the right side of the fabric. And looks like I need to make my slits a little bigger, no problem. Okay, so after the magnetic snap goes through the right side of the fabric, I'm going to flip to the wrong side and put that little scrap of interfacing on top of my prongs. If you had a washer, the washer comes up last. So you can either use a pair of snap pliers, or I'm going to use the edge of my workspace. And I'm just going to lean the prongs one at a time against my workspace and just open them outward. So let me just shift this over. Okay, so I'm just easily leaning the prong against my workspace and opening the prongs outward. And this is what it should look like after you've gotten it installed, and this is what it looks like from the right side of the fabric. So go ahead and pull out the exterior flap, and we're going to place these right sides together. I'm going to go ahead and place wonder clips on the sides and the bottom. And we're going to sew the sides and the bottom using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so let's take this over to the sewing machine. Okay, now I'm going to cut notches wherever there's a curved edge, and a notch is just cutting a small V about every 1/2 inch. And what notching does is it just removes the excess fabric so that when you turn the fabrics wrong sides together and press, you don't have a bunch of fabric bunched up through the curves. You can also use some pinking shears to accomplish this as well. Okay, so I'm going to turn this right side out and press. And since I'm using cork, and you'll want to do the same thing if you're using vinyl or leather, I'm going to, instead of pressing with my iron, I'm going to finger press instead. So I'm going to finger press and just put some wonder clips to hold the edges together. If you're using all quilting cotton, feel free to use your iron and give it a press instead. Okay, so go ahead and press the entire outer edge. I'm also going to put some wonder clips on the raw edges to hold them together. And we're going to be sewing around the entire outer edge of this flap using an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to lengthen my stitch length to 3 millimeters for this top stitching, just because I've got a lot of fabric layers that are coming into play now. And we'll be sewing the sides and the bottom, including this raw edge, using an 1/8 of an inch seam. Okay, and I'm actually using a coordinating thread for my top thread to match my accent fabric, and my bobbin thread actually matches my lining fabric just so everything blends in. Okay, now go ahead and pull out your corner accents. So if you're using cork or leather or another fabric that can be cut raw, make sure your pieces are cut out along the dashed lines. And since I'm using cork, that's what I did. I'd also like to show you what you need to do if you're using quilting cotton. So for quilting cotton, you'll be cutting along the solid black lines, and you'll be cutting in 2 mirror image pairs. So mirror image just means that they're not the same. They're sort of a reflection of the 2 pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and place one of my pairs right sides together, place some wonder clips on the edges, and I'm just going to be sewing this edge right here using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, make sure you change back to your regular stitch length, and mine is 2.5 millimeters. And I just wanted to mention here that I usually get a nicer curve if I continuously sew. So even if you have to sew really slowly, just keep sewing through the curve without stopping if possible, and that'll end up with a nicer curve. You can stop once you get to the straight edge and reposition things if you need to. Okay, and I'm going to cut notches wherever there's a curve. So again, notches was cutting the small V's. And when you get to this inner area right here, cut a slightly larger notch out of the fabric. Okay, so I'm going to turn right side out and press. And I'm going to use my fingers to roll out the seams. Okay, so you'll repeat the same process with all of your pairs of corner accents. So now let me show you how to attach. You're going to pull out your exterior main panel, and we're going to be attaching the accents in the bottom corners, and again, they need to be mirror images of each other. So I've got my 2 pieces cut from the cork. If you'll notice, the edge that's a little bit taller is the edge that will be vertical right here. So this edge right here is not as long as this one right here. And if you're not sure, you can always pull out your pattern piece and compare so that you're placing your accent in the correct spot up and down. Okay, so I'm going to put some wonder clips along the side edges. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to lengthen my stitch length to 2.5 millimeters on my machine. And we're going to be sewing the entire outer edge of each of these accents using an 1/8 inch seam allowance. And again, just do the best you can, even if you have to sew really slowly, to sew continuously through the curves. And if it helps you, you can mark 1/4 inch down from this inner edge over here so that you know where to stop sewing to bring your needle down. So having that marking there might help you so that you know where to come down and pivot. All right, let's take this over to the sewing machine. Okay, and you'll repeat this process to sew down that second corner accent, and you'll also need to sew down the remaining 2 corner accents on your second exterior main panel piece. Okay, so for this next section, we're going to be attaching the buckle. So I wanted to tell you what to do if you could not find a buckle with a tongue, which is what this is. I'm going to be showing you how to install just a metal rectangle if you'd prefer not to use a buckle, or if you just have trouble finding one in the correct size. So never fear if you're having trouble with the buckles, finding them, or you'd just rather not use one, a metal rectangle will work as well. Okay, so we're going to be sewing the buckle accents. So let me first show you what to do if you're using quilting cotton. So if you're using quilting cotton, again, you'll be cutting your pieces out using the buckle accent pattern piece around the solid black lines. So I'm just going to place two of my fabrics right sides together. And we're going to be sewing both of the long edges as well as this curved edge over here. And that's going to be using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We're not going to sew this edge at all. Okay, so now we're going to make notches wherever there's a curved edge. Okay, and then I'm going to turn this right side out and press. So I'm going to use my fast turn turning tool. This is what my tool looks like, and it has sort of a corkscrew at the end which helps pull the fabric right side out. So I'm going to insert the tube first through the opening, and then the end with the corkscrew will be inserted through the tube, and I'll poke it through this end of the fabric, and the corkscrew helps because it pulls the fabric through the tube. Okay, and then I'm just going to twist to release that corkscrew, and then I'm going to give this a good press. I'm going to use my precision turning tool to push it inside and make sure that my curved edges are pushed out. Okay, I'm going to use my fingers to roll the seams out and then give it a good press. So you'll repeat this same process for your second pair of the buckle accent pieces. And if you're using cork or leather, you'll instead be placing your two pieces wrong sides together, and you should have cut your pieces out along the dashed lines on the pattern piece. So I've got two of my pieces placed wrong sides together, and I actually used some fabric glue. I like using the Beacon 3-in-1, and I just put a little bit of glue on the wrong sides of the fabric and allowed the glue to dry. So this is the quilting cotton method, and this is what you'll do if you're using cork or leather. Okay, so now we're going to take this over to the sewing machine and top stitch the outer edge using an 1/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to be stitching the flat buckle underside pieces. So if you're using quilting cotton, you'll place two pieces right sides together. And we're going to be stitching both of the long edges using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'm going to turn this right side out and give it a press. So again, I'm using the fast turn tool and inserting the corkscrew. This time there's not an end of a fabric here to grab onto, so I'm just going to grab on to a little bit of the side. Basically anywhere on the side is fine. Okay, so I'm going to use my fingers to roll out the seams and give this a press. So this is what you should do if you're using quilting cotton. Okay, if you're using cork, leather, or vinyl, you'll just use one single layer of fabric here. So regardless if you're using the quilting cotton or cork or leather, we're going to top stitch both of the long edges using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and you'll repeat that same process for the second flat buckle underside. Okay, so this particular step is only if you're using an actual buckle with a tongue piece. If you're instead using the metal rectangle, no need to make a hole here because your rectangle obviously does not have a tongue that you need to make a hole for. So again, no hole if you're just using that metal rectangle. Okay, I'm using the buckle, so I'm going to draw a line that's centered and 6 inches down from this short straight edge right here. Okay, so you have about 3 different options here. If you're using quilting cotton, I would suggest either making a small buttonhole stitch with your sewing machine before you cut out a hole for the tongue. You can also use a grommet if you'd like to install a grommet here. That will finish the edges. Since I'm using cork fabric, which can be left raw, I'm just going to go ahead and straight up just make the hole and leave it like that. So you have a few options here as far as finishing the hole if you're using the buckle piece with the tongue. So I'm just going to use my rivet press. It has a hole punch die on it, and I'm just going to go ahead and make that hole. Okay, if you decided to use the buttonhole stitch on your sewing machine after you sew that buttonhole stitch, and again it'll be a small one, and you might want to test it out on a small scrap of fabric first, then you'll make the hole through the fabric. Okay, so we also need to make a hole in the flat buckle underside piece, and again, if you're just using the metal rectangle instead of the buckle with the tongue, please don't make a hole here. I'm using the buckle with the tongue, so I'm going to make a hole on my piece that's 5 3/4 of an inch down from the top edge. So I'm just going to take my ruler and make that mark, and the marking is going to be centered. And I'm going to use my rivet press to make the hole through the fabric. If you're using quilting cotton, as before, you'll want to use either a buttonhole stitch or you can use a grommet to finish off that hole. Okay, so now go ahead and pull out your flap piece, and we're going to start assembling the flap with the buckle. So again, if you're just using the metal rectangle, you're just going to slide that rectangle on your fabric so that it's wrong sides together. The short ends will be aligned, and we're going to assemble the piece just like so. If you're using the buckle, you're instead going to place the buckle through the hole. So I'm going to go ahead and slide that on there right now. And again, the raw edges should be aligned. So I'm just going to go ahead and put a wonder clip on there to hold the raw edges for now. I'm going to take my ruler and my Clover Choco, and I'm going to draw a line that's 2.5 inches in from the left hand edge. And it's going to be 2.5 inches in from the top corner. I'm going to place the buckle piece to the inside of the line. So I'm going to place it right here. Okay, so I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to get as close as I can to the hardware and I'm going to come up the other side. Okay, so I have my stitch length increased to 3 millimeters. My top thread matches my accent fabric and my bobbin thread matches the lining fabric. Okay, you'll repeat this same process for the right hand side of the bag as well. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and add these two pieces right here. So again, if you just have a metal rectangle, we're just going to be sliding it through the rectangle. If you have the buckle with the tongue, you'll be inserting the tongue through the hole in this piece as well. And depending on the shape of your buckle piece, you might have a little bit of overhang on the top edge right here. Just go ahead and leave that there for now. So I'm going to place a wonder clip on this piece. Make sure your buckle piece, if you're using one, is nice and flat. And then I'm going to do the same thing on this end as well. Okay, so just go ahead and pull that buckle accent through, regardless if you're using the buckle piece or the metal rectangle. Okay, so there's a few options. I suggest going ahead and stitching down this buckle accent piece in the same manner that we did with the underside piece just before. So again, I'm going to sew using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Make sure that your bobbin thread matches your lining fabric. And we're going to stop about a 1/4 inch away from the buckle or the metal rectangle and sew back up this side. For this end right here, you can sew perhaps a rectangle, or if you just like to do a straight line of stitching just to secure this piece so that it doesn't move around. Of course, if you'd like to leave it loose, you can as well, but I'm going to be sewing a metal rectangle on both of these pieces to hold the lower edge down as well. And I decided, because of the shape of my buckle, that I would like to sew 2 lines of stitches. I sewed a 1/2 inch away from the buckle, and the lines of stitches are a 1/4 inch apart. Okay, so this is what your flap should look like after you've attached both of the buckle accent pieces. So go ahead and trim any overhang at the top of the flap, and this will again depend on what type of buckle you've used. And then let's go ahead and put that flap piece to the side for now. So now we're going to start assembling the side accent pieces. So if you're working with quilting cotton, take 2 of your side accent pieces out and place them right sides together. We're going to be sewing both of the long edges using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, and I'm going to switch my stitch length back to my usual stitch length, and my usual is 2.5 millimeters. Okay, we're going to turn that side accent right side out and give it a good press. Okay, I'm going to use my fingers to roll the seams to either side. And if you're working with cork, vinyl, or leather, you'll just be cutting your pieces as is according to the dashed lines instead. Okay, so let's take this over to the sewing machine, whichever method you're using. We're going to top stitch both of the long edges using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and you'll sew the other side in the same manner. Okay, again, we're going to be addressing these side accents. If you're just using a metal rectangle, please do not make holes here. No holes are needed for the metal rectangles. I'm using the buckle with the tongue, so I am actually going to make holes, and it's going to be the same as before. If you're making the holes, you have a few options. You can either use the buttonhole stitch on your sewing machine. You can just make a hole through your fabric if you're using something that can be left raw, or you can install grommets if you like the look of grommets and would like to, I guess, bling it up a little bit. Okay, so separate the two side accents in pairs. We're going to be doing each pair one at a time. So the first two side accents, we're going to be having a hole that's exactly centered. So it's going to be centered from the long edge and centered in from the short edge. Okay, so I'm going to make both of these holes first, and then we'll address the remaining two pairs of the side accents. Okay, so for the remaining two pairs of side accents, the marking is going to be centered up from the long edge, but it's going to be only 2 inches down from the short edge. Okay, and again, you'll be finishing these holes in the method of your preference, either the buttonhole stitch, just raw holes like I'm doing, or with the grommets. Okay, so if you're just using the metal rectangle, you'll just go ahead and take one of the side accents and place the metal rectangle on the fold just like this. Again, if you're using the rectangle, you'll also place that second side accent piece on top. So this is what it looks like from the back. So I'm using the buckle piece. So first we're going to be working with the side accent piece with the hole that's exactly centered. So I'm going to go ahead and place that so that the tongue goes through the hole. Okay, and I'm just going to place a wonder clip on this edge just for now, just to hold the layers together. Okay, so the other remaining side accent piece is measured 2 inches in from the short end. So I'm going to place that edge toward the right hand side. So this is 2 inches in, and so I'm going to go ahead and slide the other half through the tongue. So when doing so, all of the raw edges will be aligned on the left-hand side. And I'm going to go ahead and pull out one of my exterior side panel pieces, and I'm going to draw a line that's 2.5 inches down from the top edge. Okay, so I'm going to place this assembled buckle piece at the line, and feel free to center it. You may have a bit of overhang, and we'll take care of that later. So I'm going to clip this down. And again, I'm going to sew using a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to sew from this end. I'm going to stop sewing about a 1/4 of an inch or as close as you can to the buckle. Sew a vertical line of stitches and come down the opposite edge again using a 1/4 of an inch, and same thing on this side over here to secure this buckle piece. And I actually realized just now that I didn't thread this through the opposite end of the buckle, so I'm just going to do that quickly before I take that over to the machine. That looks much better. All right, let's get this over to the sewing machine. Okay, and I'm going to increase to 3 millimeters for this stitching right here. Okay, and you'll repeat the same process for the second exterior side panel. And depending on your preference, I decided to have the buckles so that they were a mirror image. So as you can see, my tongue piece is facing toward the inside as I have these laid flat. It's up to you. Whatever you prefer is totally fine. So now I'm just going to go ahead and trim the overhang. And then go ahead and put both of these pieces to the side for now. Okay, now go ahead and pull out your strap piece and flip it so that it's wrong side facing up. And we're going to press this in half, wrong sides together, so that both of the long edges meet. And then you'll just continue pressing the entire length of the strap. Go ahead and open out your fabric and press the lower edge in toward the center crease. Again, press the entire length of the strap, and then we're also going to press the top edge down toward the center crease. Okay, go ahead and refold the fabrics and give it one more press. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and place some wonder clips on the edges of the fabric. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and top stitch both long edges of the strap using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm going to lengthen my stitch length for this top stitching, so I'm going to lengthen to 3 millimeters. Okay, now go ahead and pull out your strap extender piece. So first I'll show you what to do for the quilting cotton. So for the quilting cotton, we're going to press so that both of the short ends meet. Then open out the fabric, press in toward the center crease. Same thing with the opposite short edge. And then go ahead and refold the fabric and press. I'm just going to go ahead and place a wonder clip on here to hold the edge in place. If you're using the cork fabric, you'll just go ahead and fold the cork wrong sides together so that the short ends meet. And I'm going to go ahead and take my scissors and just go ahead and cut directly along the crease to create two separate pieces. Okay, regardless if you're working with the quilting cotton or the cork, we're going to sew both of the long edges using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and I have my stitch length turned back to my regular, which is 2.5 millimeters on my machine. And you'll repeat this process for both of the strap extender pieces. Okay, now I'm going to take my ruler and draw 2 lines on the short end of the strap, each end actually. So the first line is going to be 1/2 inch in, and the second line is going to be 1.5 inches in. Okay, so I'm going to press at those lines. And I'm going to slide a swivel clip on each end. So you'll be using 2 swivel clips in total. Okay, so I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to stitch 1/8 of an inch away from the folded edge and also 1/4 of an inch away. And you'll repeat the same process for the opposite end. Okay, now go ahead and pull out your exterior side panel, your strap extender piece, and you can either use a D-ring or a triangle ring here. In fact, even a rectangle ring will work. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and fold the strap extender in half and place the hardware directly in the middle, just like that. And then I'm going to place the raw edge of the strap extender centered on the top edge of my exterior side panel. Okay, so I'm going to use a wonder clip to clip this in place, and then I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and stitch this down using 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, and you'll repeat this same process to attach the second strap extender to the remaining exterior side panel. Okay, now go ahead and pull out your zipper pocket piece and place the fabric so that it's wrong side facing up. The short edge should be at the top, and I always like to draw a little T at the top edge so that when I'm measuring things, I don't get mixed up what the top edge is. So I'm going to draw a horizontal line that's 10 inches down from the top edge. And just draw that line straight across. Okay, I'm going to draw a second horizontal line that's 1/2 inch below the first. And I'm going to draw 2 vertical lines that are each 1 inch in from the side edges. Okay, so now I'm going to pull out one of the lining main panels and make sure that you lay the lining so that it's long ways, just like this. Okay, I'm going to place the fabrics right sides together. Let me move this one down. The bottom edge of the zipper pocket is going to be 1 inch higher than the bottom edge of the lining main panel. And you also want that zipper pocket piece to be centered. So you can either finger press both pieces to find a center crease and align them, or you can just go ahead and measure in from the side edges. So you want 1 inch visible on each of the side edges. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put a couple of traditional pins to hold the layers in place. I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew directly on top of the lines that I drew in order to stitch a rectangular box. Okay, one little tip, in case your needle does not come down directly in the corner where the lines intersect, you can always decrease your stitch length. So you can decrease to 1 millimeter or 1.5 millimeter, stitch one stitch, and then turn back to your regular stitch length. Okay, now I'm going to take my ruler and draw a line that's halfway up the box. So in other words, it'll be 1/4 of an inch up, and the line is going to stop 1/4 of an inch away from either end. Okay, so where I've stopped drawing the line, I'm going to draw an outward facing V. Okay, I'm going to take my seam ripper and get a hole started, and then I'm going to use my scissors the rest of the way. So I'm cutting through both layers of fabric. And then when you get to the V's, cut as far into the corners as you can without cutting the stitches. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and push the pocket through the opening on either side. And I'm going to use my fingers to roll out the seams. So I'm going to start along the bottom edge, and I'm going to roll out the seams and then use my iron to press. Okay, when it comes to the side edges of that opening, if your fabric looks bunched up, that just means you didn't cut far enough into the V. So if that's the case, go ahead and flip the zipper pockets back through the opening and recut your V's. Okay, so now we're going to insert the zipper in that opening. So I generally like to work with a longer zipper than is necessary, and I always like to center the zipper in the opening. The reason for that is I like to avoid the end of the zipper because that metal zipper stop can break a needle. I also like to avoid the very beginning of the zipper because where the zipper teeth end, that kind of creates a gap right there. So I'm going to go ahead and use some Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape to stick it to the zipper because traditional pins will make the zipper look wavy once it's sewn in place. So Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape is basically just double-sided tape. It's 1/4 of an inch in thickness and it's safe to sew with. So I'm going to go ahead and first just stick that tape down to the lower edge of the zipper, and I only need to tape the zipper the length of that opening. Okay, so I'm just going to push that down, and then I'm going to remove the side of the paper to reveal the second side of the adhesive. And then I'll do the same thing on the top edge of the zipper as well. Okay, so I'm going to place the zipper underneath the opening. Go ahead and leave that zipper head to the side for now. And you want equal amounts of the zipper tape to be showing on the top and the bottom. The nice thing about the Dritz Wash Away Wonder Tape is that it's water soluble. So in case you see some of the adhesive after you sew the zipper in place, you can go ahead and just spritz it with some water and rub it with your fingernail a bit, and the adhesive will go away. Okay, so I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the fabric. I'm going to work my way around the rectangle, and when I reach approximately here, I'm going to stop with the needle down, lift the presser foot up, zip that zipper head past my foot, and then finish up the rectangle. Okay, now I'm going to flip to the wrong side of the zipper, and I'm going to trim the zipper tape to within about 1/4 of an inch on either side. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and bring this top edge of the zipper pocket fabric down so that the bottom edges are aligned. And we're going to sew the 3 raw edges using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, except you're not sewing on top of your lining main panel at all. So go ahead and push that out of the way just like this. Okay, now we're going to be assembling the divider pocket. So you should have 2 divider pocket pieces. Go ahead and flip them so that they're right sides together. And I'm going to go ahead and pin the top edge. We're going to be sewing the top edge only using 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, now go ahead and press that seam open. And then also go ahead and press the fabrics wrong sides together. Okay, we're going to top stitch the top finished edge using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, go ahead and pull out your remaining lining main panel, and we're going to place that divider pocket piece directly on top. So the side and bottom edges will be aligned. I'm going to place some wonder clips on the edges to hold them in place. And before I put clips on this side, I'm going to draw a vertical line that's 6 inches in from the side edge. This is just to create a divider in the pocket, so there's different sections, and you can use whatever increments that you'd like. If you'd like more than one vertical line of stitching on here, you can have that as well. Okay, so I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew the sides and the bottom using 1/8 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to start sewing from the bottom and stitch directly on top of the line, and especially when you reach the top edge of the pocket, make sure to backstitch. Okay, now go ahead and pull out your lining bottom panel, and we're going to place those right sides together along the bottom edge of the bag. So I'm going to use my wonder clips to hold the bottom edge, and we're going to sew this edge using 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so we're going to trim this seam in half, so to about approximately 1/4 inch, and no need to measure this, you can just eyeball it, that's fine. Okay, and I'm going to press the seam open. Okay, so now I'm going to attach the remaining lining main panel to the opposite long edge of the lining bottom panel. Okay, so you want to have both lining main panels facing the correct way, so this pocket opening will be toward the top of the bag, and the zipper pocket also toward the top of the bag. And we need to leave an opening for turning everything right side out when the bag is finished. So you can either leave the opening along the bottom edge of the bag, and you want that opening to be centered. It should be about 8 or 9 inches long for that opening, or you can leave the opening in the zipper pocket. Since we already sewed that bottom edge closed, if you would like to leave the opening in the bottom of the zipper pocket, you just need to take your seam ripper and make an opening there. If you decide to turn through the zipper pocket, make sure you unzip your zipper first so that you have somewhere to grab and pull everything right side out. So I'm going to actually leave my opening at the bottom of the zipper pocket. So I'm going to sew this entire edge. Again, if you decide to leave the opening right here, make sure you leave yourself an opening and don't sew that entire edge. Okay, I'm also going to trim down that seam that I just sewed. And then I'm going to press the seam open. Okay, so now it's time to add one of the lining side panels. So here's my bottom panel right here. This is where we're going to first start pinning the lining side panel. So I'm going to flip these so that they're right sides together. I'm going to make sure this edge is aligned, and it needs to be centered. So that means the same portion of the side panel is going to overhang this seam of the bottom panel by the same increments. So I'm going to take my ruler to measure and make sure that that's accurate. All right, so it's going to overhang by approximately a ½ inch on either side, and I'm going to start pinning right here. Okay, so now I'm going to start by pinning the top corner of the bag. So here's the top edge of the side panel. And I'm going to go ahead and pin this edge, easing it in. And I'm going to do the same thing for the opposite end of the side panel. Okay, so we're going to be sewing this pinned edge using a ½ inch seam allowance. Before I take this over to the sewing machine, the edges where there's a curve, I'm going to take my scissors and make little tiny clips that are about ¼ inch high. That'll help the fabric spread more evenly through the curve. All right, so let's take this over to the machine. Again, it's going to be a ½ inch seam allowance. Okay, and I'm going to be sewing with the main panel against the bed of my sewing machine. And as I'm getting toward the curve, I'm just going to lift the needle and the presser, lift the presser foot up with the needle down, and just make sure with my fingers that the edges of the fabric are smoothed over so that I'm not sewing over a pucker. Okay, so I'm going to trim that seam that I just sewed in half, so to about ¼ inch. Okay, so we're going to repeat this same process to attach the lining side panel to the opposite end of the bag. So let's start off with this area flat. Here's the bottom panel right here. Again, we're going to pin the lining side panel to the bottom panel first, and then we'll pin the top corners. And I'm just making sure that my bottom panel is centered. Okay, so I'm going to start pinning from this top corner. Okay, and same thing as before, we're going to sew the pinned edges using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so this is what your lining should look like after you've sewn both of the side panels in place and trimmed the seams down to 1/4 inch. Okay, so now if you're using the optional purse feet, let me show you how to install those. So I'm going to take my ruler and measure in 1.5 inches away from each edge and make a mark. So if you're using a quilting ruler, that'll be fairly easy. And then you'll just do the same marking in from each corner. Okay, so I'm going to use my seam ripper to make a small slit at each marking, and then that's where I'll be installing the purse feet. So purse feet come in different sizes and designs. I'm using sort of dome-shaped purse feet, but if you're using something that's rounded or a different design, that's completely fine. So again, same thing as with the magnetic snap, it's always good to start with a smaller slit. You can always make a smaller slit bigger. And then I'm going to follow up the slits that I made with a dab of seam sealant. Okay, so I'm going to insert the purse foot through the right side of the fabric. And then on the wrong side, go ahead and use your fingers. I usually like to push both of the prongs to one side, kind of to separate them. And then you can separate the prongs like that. Okay, now we're going to insert the remaining half of the magnetic snap. So go ahead and pull out your exterior main panel that you would like to be the front of your bag. We're going to draw a line that's centered and 4.5 inches down from the top edge. Okay, so I'm going to draw a mark for that magnetic snap. And it's the same installation process as before. So I'm going to go ahead and use my washer and mark the slits for the prong. Since the exterior main panel fabric is attached to foam interfacing, which is rather substantial, there's no need to use an extra square of interfacing like we did for the flap. Of course you can if you'd like to, that's perfectly fine. I'm going to add the seam sealant to the slits that I made. And then I'm going to insert the female portion of the magnetic snap through the right side of the fabric. And then attach the washer to the back. Okay, just as you did before, go ahead and open those prongs outward. Okay, so now let's start putting the exterior together. So go ahead and grab your exterior bottom panel, and we're going to place these right sides together. The bottom edge of the bag is the edge where the accents are. So I'm going to pin the bottom edge only, and we're going to sew the bottom edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, I'm going to trim that seam in half, so again to about 1/4 inch. And this time I'm going to press the seam toward the bottom panel. So since I'm using cork, I'm just going to finger press that for now. Okay, so now it's time to add the remaining exterior main panel to the other long edge of the exterior bottom panel. So this is what it should look like before I flip the fabrics right sides together. Again, we're going to be sewing this pinned edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, again, we're going to be trimming this seam in half. And then we'll start adding the side panels one at a time. And the process is the same as with the lining. Again, I'm just going to finger press that seam toward the bottom. Okay, so let's attach that first exterior side panel. Okay, move these out of the way. Again, I'm going to take my ruler and just make sure that my side panel is overhanging that bottom panel seam by the same increment on either side. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start pinning with this top corner. And then pin from the opposite corner as well. Okay, again, I'm going to take my scissors and make little clips about 1/4 inch high wherever there's a curved edge. And then I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and sew the pinned edge using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, go ahead and trim that seam down in half. Okay, we're going to be adding the remaining exterior side panel in the same manner. Okay, so go ahead and continue pinning that side panel in place. Make sure you leave your clips with your scissors wherever there's a curve, about 1/4 inch high. And we'll be sewing this seam using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so here's what your exterior should look like when both of those side panels are attached, and both of those seams will be trimmed down to 1/4 inch. So go ahead and turn your exterior right side facing out. Okay, we're going to be attaching the flap to the edge that does not have the the magnetic snap. So the opposite side is where we'll be attaching the flap. And I'm going to place my flap centered in between both of these seams at the top, and the lining side should be facing you. Okay, so I'm just going to do a double check with my ruler to make sure that that flap is indeed centered, and it is. And then I'm going to continue pinning the rest of the way. So I'm going to stitch this flap to my exterior using 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, now we're going to add the lining. So leave the lining wrong side facing out. And the lining is going to slip over the exterior. So I wanted my zipper pocket on the back of the bag where the flap is. Either way is fine, whatever your preference. Just going to go ahead and smoosh that exterior so that it fits inside. You want to make sure your flap and your strap extenders are tucked in between the layers. And we're going to be aligning the side seams first. So let's start with this end of the bag. So I'm going to line the side seams so that they're directly on top of each other. I'm going to use my fingers to press that seam open, and I'm going to pin it in place. So go ahead and pin your side seams first, and then we'll pin the rest of the way around. Okay, so now I'm going to pin the front and the back of the bag. So I prefer to pin from the center outward, so I'm going to use my fingers to kind of walk the fabric so that the right side's together. And then I'm going to pin outwards, and that helps me more evenly distribute the fabric so that I don't have one end that's more bunched up. Okay, same thing for the back of the bag. Okay, we're going to be sewing the entire top edge of the bag using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, go ahead and trim this seam in half. And if you prefer, you can also trim one of the seams out of the two even smaller than 1/4 to help them lie more flat when you go to do the top stitching. If you'd like to do what I just mentioned about trimming one of the seams of the two even smaller, I'd suggest doing it with the foam interfacing. So you'll just be trimming it a little bit smaller than the seam that's on the lining half, and you'll continue doing this all the way around. Okay, so now it's time to pull everything right side out through either the opening that you left in your lining on the bottom panel or through an opening that you ripped in the zipper pocket. Okay, so you'll want to give everything a good press. If you're using cork or leather like I did, you may consider, instead of using the iron to press, just placing some Wonder Clips on all the seams for a few hours, and that'll press the seams quite nicely. Otherwise, if you made your entire bag out of quilting cotton, you can just go ahead and, instead of finger pressing like I am, use the iron to press. And so what that will look like is you'll instead flatten the seams against your ironing board and take your iron and hit all the seams, including up the sides and on the back. Okay, so you want to close up the opening that you left either in that zipper pocket or in the lining. So there's two ways that you can do this. For either method, you want to flip the raw edges toward the inside by about 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to place some Wonder Clips on those edges. So you can either machine stitch this opening closed using an 1/8 inch seam allowance, or you can slip stitch the opening by hand, which means you won't have any visible top stitches to close your opening. If you'd like, I have a free video up on my YouTube channel on how to do a slip stitch in case you're interested in that. I'm going to close my opening by machine, so I'm just going to be using an 1/8 inch seam allowance. All right, so I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine and close my opening. Okay, so I'm going to shove that zipper pocket inside my lining. Push everything down inside the bag. And again, you can either press this opening or the top edge of the bag with your iron. I'm actually going to finger press my opening and place some Wonder Clips on there. So the final step is to top stitch this top edge. So I'm going to place Wonder Clips all along the top edge. And we'll be top stitching using 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to lengthen my stitch length for this top stitching just to handle the different layers. When you go to top stitch the back of the bag where the flap is attached, you'll just spread the flap away from the body of the bag, and I like to sew this area slowly so that I can take my hand and place it underneath the flap and make sure that the edge is flat as it comes to the sewing machine. Also, I'm going to have my top thread match my exterior fabric and my bobbin thread match my lining fabric so that everything blends in nicely. All right, so let's take this over to the sewing machine. Okay, and here's the part where you want to smooth out the underside of your flap as you approach each area. Okay, now all that's left is to attach the side strap. If you plan on putting something heavy inside your Kennedy bag, you may consider making a false bottom for that, and instructions on how to do that. I also have a free video up on my YouTube channel on false bottoms. So you're all finished, and enjoy your bag. Thanks so much for sewing along with me. I can't wait to see your finished bag. Be sure to post a photo of your finished project in my Facebook group. And remember, if I can do it, so can you.